Oh, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Alison from the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. Welcome to our final workshop with Patrick Danaher, writing an excellent journal article. Uh, it's also our last workshop for the year. So it's been a big year, but very successful. So I want to thank Patrick for your time this year in delivering some great workshops for our students. Um, so I'll post a few links in the chat box about becoming a member of the Postgraduate Association and keeping all these great workshops running. And also where our recording will go to our YouTube channel. So thank you so much. It's all yours now, Patrick. Thanks.
Thanks, Alison. Thanks so much. And look, um, I'll get to a slide thanking the SCPA shortly, but huge thanks to Alison and to Craig and everyone else in the amazing Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. It's great to be here for this final workshop for me for the year and for SCPA for the year. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed this work and opportunity to meet so many new people and find out some of the exciting things you're doing. So that's really terrific, a great pleasure. And so, look, today is writing an excellent journal article, which I think, as is often the case, all the great ideas have come from Alison. And as I recall, this was one of Alison's excellent suggestions. So I want to cover a few different things in relation to journal articles today. And of course, people are at different stages in terms of writing journal articles. Some of you may well be very accomplished at doing so, and so some of you might be working on your very first journal article. So regardless of where you are in the process and so on, hopefully there are some things here that may be of interest, and it'll be really good in the discussion to find out what you're doing and how you're getting on with writing journal articles and so on. All right. So in terms of the acknowledgement of country and so on, uh, really interestingly, the Bunya Pines, many of you may be familiar with Bunya Pines, and even with this area and so on, which is north of Toowoomba. And it was really interesting to read that over millennia, these various Indigenous communities, Waka Waka, Jawa, and Boangum, hosted people who travelled hundreds and I think thousands of kilometres, and it went over several days and so on. And so the Bunya Pines and that area in the photograph were the location for people coming together for celebration, uh, working across different, as I understand, different language groups, certainly different communities of people. And I think that's really wonderful. So on behalf of Empowering Editing, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, including the Jagera, Jayabal and Jaiwa people of the Toowoomba region, where I'm located, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. All right, so these are some of the things that I want to cover. Some of these will be familiar to you from previous workshops. Some of the things that are unique to this presentation, all of these are tailored, of course, but unique in terms of journal articles. I want to cover four underlying elements of what makes an effective journal article, indicators of effective journal articles, really importantly, a strategic approach to the article, but possibly even more importantly, to thinking about the target journal as part of a broader strategy for progressing and disseminating your research findings, visualizing the article's proportionality, writing the abstract. And what I've done here is that Alison kindly shared with me the disciplines and subject areas that the participants come from, and a wonderfully wide range, and I'm really grateful for that. It's really good to hear people's different perspectives. So what I've done in brackets is to indicate the disciplines. So what I've tried to draw on is a diversity of disciplines. So in terms of writing the abstract, disability policy, the introduction's opening sentence, which is sometimes overlooked, but can actually make a huge difference to, if nothing else, to how you feel about your own journal article, but hopefully also to reviewers and readers and so on. Writing the literature review, I've drawn on health for writing the results. A really good article I came across there from health. one reviewer's perspective on marketing and so on. And what I really want to end on, normally I end on a note of encouragement, still a note of encouragement, but don't despair. This is a personal story, sixth time lucky. And so at the end, I'll come back to that sixth time lucky. One of the things, just to put this in a bit of perspective, I think that's on the next slide, was again, huge thanks to Alison and everyone else involved and all the participants. Yes. So anyway, just before we get into this, just to let you know, some of what I'm drawing on here comes from, I'm sure like a number of you, I've reviewed for different journals. I've edited a couple of journals. At the moment, I'm one of the executive editors for teaching and teacher education, and some of you working in education may well be aware of that. It's a grand title, executive editor. Really, all it means is that I'm assigned a number of submissions and manuscripts, and I'm responsible for reviewing the article, but also for aligning it with or sending it out to different reviewers and so on. So I want to draw on that experience because it does inform some of the things that we're talking about here. So anyway, some of these caveats, there are many ways that you can write effective journal articles. So there are some differences between qualitative, quantitative mixed methods, but there are also some fundamental commonalities and synergies, and that's a good thing. Nothing is intended to disagree with or contest what your supervisors or course team members say to you. That's a little bit about me, and probably most importantly for today, I've certainly had more than my fair share of rejection letters and emails about journal articles and so on. So I feel people's pain if that's something that you have experienced or are going through at the moment. And I do have a few suggested strategies for engaging with that. All right, so that's Alison's wonderful graphic and so on. And so in the next few slides, I do want to talk about communicating originality and significance. I do want to talk about how we align the different constituent elements, and that relates to proportionality, which we'll come to quite soon. And this really important question of ensuring appropriate breadth and depth within the constraints of sometimes it's 6,000 words, 8,000 words, 10,000 words. Sometimes it's more than that. But it's definitely a discipline to contain and constrain everything within the word count, something to concentrate the mind, as they say. All right. And so this notion of excellent as being fit for purpose is something that I'll come back to in the really strategic question about selecting target journals, which we'll come to. All right. So, and again, this is basically the same slide each time, but for me, this is actually really crucial. This notion of scholarly voice, some people might call it something different. That's absolutely fine. But this underpins everything you do in relation to writing your journal articles, including responding to the reviewer feedback if you get through to that stage, and hopefully you will. And so we'll come back to this notion of the scholarly voice, because really what it at the fundamentally what this is about is having a very clear and confident, not overly confident, but confident sense of the significance of what you've written and how it contributes to existing knowledge and so on. And I don't think that you can do this process effectively without that sense. And of course, it develops over time and so on. Okay, so in terms of 4 underlying elements of effective, excellent journal articles and so on. Now, if we look at these things, again, a lot of this relates to a thesis or to a book or whatever. But really importantly, it's the recognizing individual and collective agency of academics and researchers. So that, to me, most of all, that's a sense of responsibility that as journal article authors, we are responsible for ensuring, obviously, the authenticity, the accuracy, the transparency, all of those really important ethical dimensions. But as well as that, we have agency in terms of why is it important? Why should the journal publish it? What does it contribute? How does it link with existing knowledge? How does it contest existing knowledge? How does it build on existing knowledge to develop new understandings and so on? In terms of the second one, short, medium, and longer term perspectives on scholarly publications, again, what that's saying is, and I'm sure no one does this, but it's not as though we sit down and say, oh, today I'm going to write a journal article. And it's the first time that we've really given it serious thought. It's something that we look at over weeks, over months, sometimes over years, in terms of matching what we're doing with particular target journals and so on. And so in terms of those strategies to ensure that our publications are sustainable and fulfilling, now that's partly to ourselves in terms of our own academic careers and trajectories and promotion or whatever it is that people might be interested in, but it's also thinking about what's the lifespan of this particular article. And so it may well be that you want something, that will contribute to knowledge for an extended time. On the other hand, there may be strategic value in saying this is actually a thought piece that will be quickly superseded, but I want to get it into still potentially a journal article or maybe a blog post or whatever, but something that has a more immediate and short-term purpose and so on. And all of that's fine. And this is really important, this notion of shared and separate interests and so on. Sometimes I've seen people, usually intrinsically, implicitly, assign agency, almost like sign away their own rights to their own agency. And so, oh, well, it's in the lap of the gods, or it's in the lap of the journal editor or the reviewers or whatever. One of the pieces of advice that I put later on is, where appropriate, to feel free to contact the journal editor. And sometimes it's having conversations with journal editors about pieces, particularly if they generate differences of opinion, which I've seen in my current role with Tate, teaching and teacher education. As I put in a later slide, sometimes there's commonality, unanimity, but quite often there's considerable diversity of opinion among reviewers. And sometimes you get that about a thesis as well, of course. And so as an editor, if I've got, Tate usually has 3 reviews of at least the first submission. Now, it may be sometimes you get 3 quite different ones, from accept, major revisions to reject, but quite more often than that, 2 at least are more aligned. But sometimes they're contradictory too, because what they're asking people to change is different across that. And so with this shared and separate interest, part of the consequence of that is to recognize that as an editor, I see it, unless the 3 initial reviews and I all say reject, which happens actually very rarely, then generally people are invested in kind of steering the manuscript through. It doesn't guarantee publication, but it makes it more likely that it will be published than not. And that's a good thing. But there are shoals, or there are, things to look out for that may actually make that less likely to occur, or more at risk, as it were. So I guess really this final dot point on this slide is about saying that a journal article manuscript as a scholarly artifact is located in complex intersections, interactions, interrelationships. And if we see it as positively as it's intended, then that can definitely assist people to see their publication through to their article through to acceptance. All right. Now, again, I use this with my own HDR students, but I think it applies also to journal articles, the 3 C's. It's really important to have clarity. Now, it's stating the obvious, I know, but whether we read a thesis chapter or a journal article manuscript, and we're not really sure what is its purpose, or there's some usually unintentional, or almost always unintentional, um, blurring of the lines about what it's seeking to do and so on, then that's a red flag. That's an indicator that work needs to be done. Coherence is really important, and it's obviously building on clarity, but I see coherence as being about aligning different elements of the process, signposting from one section of the text to another, really thinking about the structure of the writing to ensure that actually the structure of the writing is invisible. If we're conscious of the structure of the writing, it probably means that where further work needs to be done. So if we think about a really well-written novel or short story, we're focused on the text, the pleasure of reading the text and responding to the text. We're not thinking about how did the author move narrative voice from first to third person or whatever it might be. All of that is done expertly, so expertly that we just don't know it's happening. And then the complexity. So that might seem a little bit odd, and sometimes complexity is in tension with clarity and coherence, but I think there needs to be complexity there. There needs to be there needs to be something at the bottom or the end of the line to say this is worth reading. Sometimes I've read something and there's clarity there and there's coherence there, but at the end I think, oh, is that it? Is that all? So, so what? I don't mean that offensively, but we need to think about complexity as particularly related to the significance of this particular piece of writing. And a few others as well: consistency, going through logically from the big picture to the small details. And that's part of alignment, that's part of coherence, but it's important to think about that. Transparency, making key aspects of the decision making and interpretation, making that explicit. And that's really important as well, because sometimes you might read a piece, a journal article, and you might think, wow, that's really well written, but I don't understand some key aspect of the data analysis. I don't know where the themes came from or the selection of discourses, or I'm puzzled. I can understand the selected discourses, but the data presented for that discourse seem discordant, seem incongruent. There seems to be some kind of inconsistency there. Again, that's something to avoid, obviously. Laying an audit trail, providing relevant examples of data collection and data analysis, and like a barrister's legal case, presenting the strongest and most diverse evidence. Sometimes, say with qualitative research, we might read work and we might read it all, and we realize, unless this is deliberate on the author's part, we realize that it's all from one participant. All right. Now, I don't know about those other qualitative researchers in the workshop today, but every time I conduct semi-structured interviews or whatever it might be, there are usually two or three people who just, we seem to be on the same wavelength. They express beautifully and brilliantly. They have golden words. And you think, oh, I hope the tape recorder is working or whatever, because that's just fantastic. And then we have people, it's not intentional, whether they have, but sometimes you think, well, that's good, but that's, in terms of data, that's perhaps less successful at articulating a particular theme or whatever it might be. I'm not being critical of people. I'm very grateful for their participation, but often it's the case. We have a relatively small number of people, So unless, as I say, that's your intention to have one or two participants in that journal article, it's something to think about. All right. Now, this is really, obviously, really, really important. And so what I've written, this is a strategic approach to the article and also to the target journal. So the examples in here are from education. All right, so now you may disagree with this first point, and that's fine. what I've written there, though, selecting the target journal, in my view, often takes second place to enacting an overarching writing strategy. And partly the reason for that is, and I put initial in brackets, again, this may not be other people's experiences. My experience, and it's an increasing experience, is that the initial target journal turns out to be the second target journal, and sometimes the third target journal, and in one case, the sixth target journal. So although we might hope that the first target journal is the one that the paper ends up being published in, that's sometimes and maybe often not the case. And so I think that one of the things to think about here is in terms of avoiding any appearance of self-plagiarism. Now, self-plagiarism is something that you may well have talked about with your colleagues, your supervisors, your students, and so on, but it's something that we need to be more and more aware of and more conscious of. Um, so, and I think these days people are more aware of this, but certainly previously, even say 5 years ago, it seemed that people and people might say this about my writing too, of course, but I got the impression sometimes that people didn't really think so much about have an overarching strategy of journal selection. And whether that was the reason or not, sometimes I've read people's work, sometimes they're people I know. And I look at 2 or 3 articles by the same person or by the same research team, and in the worst case scenarios, I can't really tell them apart. I have the sense, rightly or wrongly, that actually they're they're very similar, not exactly the same, but they're very similar. That's not a good impression. That's really, it's really important to guard against that, and I'll come to a few strategies for doing that. But as I've written here, it's disturbingly easy for several publications about the same research project to have the look and feel of being very similar to one another. And now, of course, I certainly acknowledge there is textual repetition and overlap. And if we think about that, often that's in the, say, in the conceptual framework and or the research design, probably particularly the research design. Sometimes a strategy, if you've got basically from the same research project, a strategy can be to have somewhat different literature reviews. And that relates to the issue of what differentiates this particular paper from others. Presumably it's a different journal or edited book or whatever, and presumably it's contributing to a somewhat different field of literature. Regardless, it is really important to be absolutely upfront from the outset and to be really transparent and explicit about that. So it's certainly appropriate to self-cite judiciously for sections. So for instance, if your research design is basically the same, it's appropriate to write an earlier version of this section of the article was published as, whatever it might be. And then basically you're covered and people understand you can only write about the selection of participants, the sampling, even data analysis in a small number of ways. But really importantly, it's correspondingly even more important then to articulate really clearly how this particular article is different from the others and contributes distinctively to the overall project. And so that's part of communicating the article's originality and significance. Now, sometimes I've seen people in Tate get into trouble when they submit articles and they forget about this. And that is ensuring appropriate breadth and depth, or ensuring that the contribution is commensurate with the article length. And so sometimes the feedback from reviewers is this manuscript is well written, but it's trying to do too many things. And so sometimes the recommendation is to scale back, delete one of the research questions or part of the data analysis or whatever it might be. So I don't know about any of you, I love the detective novels, particularly of Agatha Christie. And the story goes that Agatha Christie, when she started writing. She was with her first husband. She didn't need to worry about earning her living. So evidently she was profligate with her magnificent plots in the first few novels. And so sometimes there were two or three brilliant plots for whodunit. Later on, she and her first husband divorced. She felt that she needed to earn her living. And so she was much more um, judicious about scaling back her writing. They were still brilliant, but there was only one plot in some of her, particularly her middle novels. So sometimes I think that's a good model. It's not about, eking out like going gold prospecting or whatever. It's not about eking out the very finest details and getting as many journal articles as you can. That probably defeats the purpose. But it is thinking about what fits within the scale and scope of this journal article as opposed to that one, as opposed to that one. Obviously, these kinds of questions and decision making, these decisions have a particular look and feel if you're writing a thesis by publication or with publication. All right, so an example from my work from many, many moons ago and so on. So what I've written there, and this is really obvious, I've written the paper draws on a broader comparative study of Australian traveller education to comment on the past, present and future in relation to Australian occupational travellers, and they were my focus. And specifically, this particular paper focuses on theorising traveller education and so on. And I was interested in that in alternative conceptions of space. And then what I did was to link that with my thesis, which focused on marginalisation, agency, and ambivalence. And so within the constraints, I still developed an argument about how that was significant. Now, an example from different education researchers, Glenda McGregor, Martin Mills, Stuart Riddle, and some of you in education would no doubt be familiar with their work. So I really like this. This paper draws together data from two projects on schooling disengagement or engagement in Australia. So one project did that, the other project did something else. We found interesting parallels, and there are a couple of examples of that. These findings have been published elsewhere, so they're upfront about that. This paper focuses on the contributions to schooling engagement that may be derived from mutually beneficial school-community relationships. So I just think that is so clever. There are these two projects. If you know those researchers, they're very rigorous, they're very well known, they've been doing this for a long time, they're very interested in Australian schooling and students feeling engaged and or disengaged. The two projects they're published widely from. And so I like this idea that this particular 2024 journal article is a work of synthesis. They're going back to what they've done before, not in a repetitive way, but through that notion of distillation and synthesis and encapsulation. And I think that's brilliant. And so they've done a great job there. All right, so some questions about this. Now, again, apologies if you've thought about this, but I think this first one is really important. What are the other publications of which this journal forms a part? And for the journal articles, which other journals are you targeting and why are you doing so? And hopefully you've already had a couple or maybe several published and so on. And so what is the totality of the publishing strategy that you're looking at and so on? And then this one, partly to guard against future rejection, what are the first, second, and maybe third journal preferences? Because if you're going to go through that effort of finding these out, and I've done this a number of times, it's good to not have to go back to that 2 months later or whatever it might be. All right. And so which features of the target journals are you looking at? Now, like anything, selecting the target journal should be a thoughtful, mindful, intelligent decision making process that you go through. I'm sure you're familiar with Schemago, which lists the various quartiles and so on of journals. We don't need to go into the politics of journal quartiles and the effects on good people who are working in or quartile 4 journals and what all that might say about the democratization of knowledge and so on. That's for another day. But it's certainly important to be aware of that. But it's equally important, or I would say even more important, to be aware of the mission, vision, purpose, and readership of the various journals, and which of those aspects are most relevant to this particular proposed article. So for me, the most important question is, what's the degree of alignment of fit between the article's focus and the target journal? That's the central question. And features like the quartile and like the um, Scopus and all of those, the H index and all of those kinds of things, they're important to think about. But to me, they take second place to this fundamental question. There's no point in having a quartile 1 incredibly well cited journal if it's really not fitting what you're submitting. And this question as well, imagine it. Someone who doesn't know your work, doesn't know you, but you want to connect with them. You don't know them either, but you want to connect with them. So where is someone who you feel would be interested in reading your article? Where are they reading? What are they reading? Which journals are they looking at? Maybe are writing in and so on. They are most likely to be reading this kind of research. All right. So visualizing the article's proportionality, and again, I guess this is stating the obvious, but if we think about it, and this is obviously comparing the research project as a whole, the book or books, if you're working on one or more books, the thesis, if you're working on a thesis. So it's thinking about from that to the journal article. So visually, we think about from War and Peace to the short stories of Chekhov, and he had 52 short stories in that particular collection. If we go from the large-scale painting of the Sistine Chapel, which is just mind-boggling, to a miniature, which is mind-boggling in a different kind of way, incredibly small. My stepfather he went from wood turning to marquetry, different tools, but it was still about skills, and it was still about envisioning what the finished product would be and how to get there. And also, if you watch Gardening Australia and so on, from a huge garden like that to bonsai. So it's just good, I think, to visualize the proportionality, working in miniature on a scaled down version of a larger work. Therefore, there's even more need for precision in writing and specificity of focus. And there's still the need to articulate and demonstrate the article's originality and significance, obviously on a smaller scale. All right, so let's then turn to writing the abstract of the article. Now, I'm not going to go through in detail in all of this, but I am going to have a look at, I guess, some of the main elements and so on. Now, interestingly, and I don't know if anyone else has observed this development, I think it's interesting anyway. Certainly when I started many, many moons ago, there was no such thing that I can recall as a structured abstract. Basically, journals just wrote abstract, introduction, whatever it might be. But increasingly, journals are mandating, or sometimes suggesting, recommending, but actually increasingly mandating structured abstracts. And I think that this is really interesting. Whether they felt that people were actually not very good at writing abstracts, as we know, sometimes we struggle. What's the difference between an abstract and an introduction? But to be honest, I think it was more about getting some kind of consistency and coherence across their products, across the published articles. And so they felt that structured abstracts would be a good way of helping them to do that. All right, so Pat Thompson, some of you might know, she is a very productive and very energetic professor of education at the University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom, originally Australian. Her PhD was something like Schooling the Kids of the Rust Belt, Rust Belt, that's right, in South Australia. And so like Martin Mills and so on, very interested in students who might be, these days we'd call them non-traditional or whatever. But anyway, Pat Thompson has a wonderful blog, if you don't know, called Patter. and it's excellent. And it's everything from dealing with examiners' feedback about the thesis through to writing structured abstracts for journal articles and so on. And so she is saying that, sorry, Pat also makes the point with structured abstracts for articles that this often these are the kinds of headings that people need to look at. So within 100 words, 150 words, 200 words, what we might see is some kind of introduction, background, or objectives, usually not called both, one or the other, methods, results or findings, originality or implications, and conclusion. Now, that's actually, if we think about it, for the very first thing that people read, whether it's the first thing you write is another matter, that's a lot to do. And therefore, if you have to do that within 200 words or so, 250 words, that's, one or two or at the most 3 sentences for each of those sections. So you have to be incredibly precise about what it is that your article does in relation to all of those. And that's why in her blog, Pat Thompson writes, having to make the originality value explicit of your paper clear in a couple of sentences is a really good exercise to do. Now, you may well do that. You may think, well, that's automatically, everyone says, that you should do that, and that's great. But it's actually, it's not something from my experience that you can do in 10 minutes. I'm going to sit down now and write the originality value statement and so on. It really takes thought, and it derives from the totality of the research project or the thesis or whatever. Now, this is an example from disability policy that Pat has put on her blog. And again, it's not about reading through in detail, but I just put on the previous slide the challenge. And I think it is a challenge of writing a structured abstract. So these people who are writing about disability policy analysis have taken up the challenge. And Pat's view, and I agree, is that they've done a good job. So within their particular assigned headings for the structured abstract from Qualitative Research Journal, they've gone through those different elements and they've done good jobs. Interestingly, Pat makes the point that increasingly some journals, probably particularly qualitative journals, but some quantitative journals are doing it as well. In terms of the implications, they're asking people to tease out what are the practical implications and, interestingly, social implications, as well as research or theoretical or, contribution to methodological knowledge, thinking about what are the implications for policy, for practice, and I guess for social life, for social cohesion, or however we might want to do that. Now, you might think there's an inflationary effect there, because what the authors have written is that this framework that they've developed has the potential and has been used successfully as a tool for disability activism to influence policy development. There's a lot in that sentence that's obviously taken up in the article itself. All right. Now, let's turn our attention to the first sentence in the journal article and see what that might look like. So sometimes we forget about that. We're so focused, we're exhausted having written the structured abstract. We think, oh, the introduction will be easy. I just write a few paragraphs and so on. Not so. Now, this is something, this first one, only because the first author is Antelis, so it's the first off the rank. I'm not privileging my own work. But this was from some years ago in a journal called Tiempo. I don't know if it's still going, but what we wanted to do in this article was whether in issue 23 of Tiempo, identified 2 different ways in which the term flexibility was being used by delegates at this particular international meeting around environmental consciousness and so on. And so we wanted to use this notion of 2 different ways of talking about flexibility as an entree, as a point of entry for our article. And we made some points about that and so on. So that's environmental education. From nursing, This scoping review synthesises evidence on parents' experiences of assessing mental health services with their adolescents for mental health challenges in Ireland. Really clear, really straightforward. It's absolutely crystal clear from the outset what this particular article and scoping review is about. All right, so that works really well. Then one from engineering, and I think this is um, I shouldn't say anything about engineers at all. This is quite poetic. And so nature has always been a source of inspiration, knowledge, and well-being from which human needs derive, and the easy prey from which they feed. I think that's beautifully written. And it's also very powerful. And implicitly it reinforces what a crucial discipline and profession engineering is. And so I think that's brilliant. That's really well done. One from health, the interplay between climate change and public health is increasingly recognised as a pivotal area of concern. Now, if you're working in that space, you may well feel that that's obvious, or that's increasingly a focus of concern. On the other hand, you might read that and think, even if you're working in health or climate change, you might think, actually, I'd not made that connection before, but the authors are right. So I'm keen to know more. And of course, that's part of the function of this first sentence. Now, this one, if you know Henry Reynolds, he is a brilliant historian of Australian Aboriginal history and so on. And I was fortunate in 1978, he was my lecturer, not just mine, lots of other people as well. Absolutely brilliant lecturer. He seemed to have no notes at all, and yet he spoke in such a really well-structured way for second-year undergraduates to be able to take really clear notes. And I couldn't find it when I was putting the slides together. I will find it later, I hope. But he wrote something like, "Explorers stand tall in Australian historiography," which, if you know Henry's work, he writes beautifully. He is a craftsperson of academic writing. So it's a pleasure to read. And of course, the idea was he wanted to say, well, for Aboriginal people, what were the relationships with European British explorers and so on. And he wrote a whole book about that topic and so on. Paul Rose, another one of my academic heroes from a very early work. There are two major problems in Renaissance science, each of which has a cultural as well as a scientific dimension. So I'm sure you guess the point, that the first sentence of the introduction that we can unintentionally overlook is actually crucial for making for setting the scene for the work that's to follow, and in some cases where we're short of time, for deciding whether we're actually going to read that article or not. All right. So in terms of the literature review, now, I've seen this sometimes previously, probably, this was informal and people didn't actually write it. But these days, more often than not, you will see in the guidelines to authors for journals, it is expected, not just encouraged, it is expected that you will refer to existing articles in the in the journal that you're targeting. Now, one of the reasons for that is part of what I was talking about briefly before, the academic politics and indeed the economy of journals. So journals are competing for space, and one of the things that they can demonstrate is that if they're well cited, then they're more successful. And one of the ways to get citations is to encourage, require people submitting to them to refer to previous work in that journal. Now, you might think, oh, shock horror, that's terrible, and so on. As I've written here, I did think that initially, but I've got over that. And I actually think it's part of the scholarly discipline. If you're targeting a journal, it's respectful to go back and to look at previous issues and articles in that same journal, and to immerse yourself in those previously published articles in that journal, recent and current, but also over time, more seminal journals, and to analyze the debates and issues that they highlight. And of course, one mention of doing that, one advantage of doing that is that it helps you to contribute to that debate or that development of a particular issue, but it also helps you to clarify and articulate the specificity of this particular article that you're working on. So win, win, win. I think that's actually quite sensible. And so if you construct your article submission as a carefully crafted response to and building on some aspects of those debates and issues, that's a really good thing. Unfortunately, if you're targeting, if you have to go through the process of second time lucky, third time lucky, fourth time lucky, the word count will actually grow up, increase. And I've had this experience recently where I've had to delete some of the first target journal references because there's no space for them in the third target journal. But anyway, something to live with, I guess. All right, so this is, I mentioned briefly, I think this is a really well written paper about writing the results, and this is taken from Health. So there are lots of ways that we can write the results section of the journal article, and these particular people say they've got three principles of doing so. One is storytelling, one is authenticity, and one is argument. And I think that those three are very well worth considering. And the authors say to help the writers envision the story they will tell, select the data as evidence for that story, and integrate quotations to guide the reader's interpretation. So I've put that in the references, I'll send the slides to Alison later. So if you're interested afterwards, you might want to track it down. Okay, so this one from Scientific Storytelling. So this particular paper that they're citing is about the phenomenon, the psychological and sociological phenomenon of shame, which is all I've read is what's here, but it seems like a really interesting study. And so these authors from Health were making the point that, of course, you could have a very matter-of-fact, very rational, very emotionless representation of the phenomenon of shame, and that would have served the purpose. But for them, they really liked the way that these people wrote about it, using the affordances of storytelling, of narrative. And so what they wrote this is in the results section, the first paragraph of the results section, the shame experiences described by the participants consisted of simultaneous multi-layered interactions between the individual and the environment. And participants' shame experiences, we came to understand those experiences through the metaphor of fire. So it may well be that individual participants use some, particular references to fire, but perhaps not. That was certainly part of the author's contribution. They thought, so shame could profoundly affect the participants. One of my pet peeves, I don't know what other people think, was when people write our participants or my participants. I always call them the participants, but that's something else. But they were talking about these intense, insidious, and or deeply troublesome shame reactions that consisted of globally negative self-assessments. And so they've got, even in the overview, they've got some of, I guess, little tasters, like a smorgasbord, little tasters of the data. So shame made me feel no good, completely worthless, an inadequate medical student, feeling small, feeling stupid. I felt like I was drowning in this negative emotion that I didn't have a name for. And really crucially for the presentation of the story, but also the argument, we identified two broad structures: shame triggers and shame promoters. So that's a well-written introduction to the results presentation. All right, the second principle for these Health authors, authenticity, selecting the best quotes for the story. And this is partly analytical, but it's also partly ethical. It's part of the relationship between the author or authors and the readers and the participants. Is the quote illustrative? That is, it's a bit like that question about validity in quantitative and some qualitative research. Does the quote actually illustrate what it's claimed to illustrate? Is the quote succinct? I'm guilty of this myself. Sometimes I put quotes that are too long. Is the quote succinct? And is it representative in the sense of representative of the individual person, but also representative of the group of participants and so on? And then in terms of argument, so This is from a different paper. This was from about GPs. If you're working in nursing or health, you may be interested. So they developed these three composite narratives. And basically Alex, Robin, and Joe on the next slide are composites. So that's a really clever narrative strategy. So the first one, GPs who had entered an academic role immediately after completing their GP training, then another group who entered an academic role mid-career, and then GPs who entered academia mid to late career. They chose gender neutral names, and although in a sense those three categories are stages of professional career, of medical careers, within those there were significant differences in relation to what the authors were looking at. All right, now engaging with the feedback, and so I'm conscious of the time, so I'll leave out one of the next sections. So engaging with the feedback, really importantly, sometimes you might not agree with the first point, but we have to, that the editor and the reviewer feedback is provided in good faith and that we enhance the qualities, clarity and quality. Some of the emails I've had with a few disgruntled authors suggest that they don't actually accept that, and oh, you don't understand my work and all of this kind of thing, and they occasionally take personal offense, which I think is really counterproductive and so on, and it's certainly not the intention. Sometimes, and this is a point I made before, sometimes editors and reviewers have different, even contradictory views. When that happens, sometimes when some of the manuscripts that I'm looking after get up to revision 3 or revision 4. All right. And so what I do in those cases is that I shepherd them through. I say, these are the things that you really need to focus on to get this through, and so on. Really importantly, it's taking charge of the revision process. And this is exactly the same, but again in miniature, when you're engaging with the examiner's feedback to your thesis. So it's not about devaluing the feedback, but it's taking charge of the feedback. How do you respond? How do you engage? What sense do you make of it? So it is appropriate in that to contact journal editors. Some journal editors may not reply, but it's worth trying. Some of them do, and they're saying, look, I can understand this is a bit tricky. There is some inconsistent advice here. This is what I recommend. So it's good to have a friend at court who can help you out appropriately, and so on. Other people may not find this. If I get minor revisions, I say, hallelujah, that's wonderful, I can do this. If I get major revisions, sometimes I think, oh goodness, I'd rather spend my time writing a new piece, because it's actually more difficult, because it actually means rewriting the fundamentals of the text. But maybe that's just me. All right, it's really important to see this as a genuine learning experience, and really importantly, this is part of your scholarly voice. What are some non-negotiable aspects of the current article? It's not good if, and the same with your thesis, it's not good if you get to the point of basically saying, well, that's the last piece of essence of my work taken away from me. And people don't do that on purpose. So it's having a clear sense in engaging with the feedback. What do I agree with? I actually accept that. What don't I agree with, but I'm happy to live with? And what actually don't I agree with and I'm not willing to change in a nice way? All right, so I'm going to get, sorry to the person from marketing, but this is the case where you should not despair, because this is the case of the sixth time lucky. So I won't go through in details about the journals, but one of the key things, Alice Brown is a friend. I was one of her PhD supervisors. She's still at USQ. That's all great. So Alice, in this relationship, in this partnership, was the one saying, keep going. As it got to the fourth rejection and the fifth rejection, I thought to myself, and I said to Alice, do we really want to spend our time on this? She said, yes, Patrick, we've got to do this. And ironically, what happened was, this is the most cited publication of mine. So if it's in, Google Scholar and all of that, it's this one. And so it was worth going. But I started my section of writing on the 24th of July, and it was finally accepted. See all those rejections? We finally got the good news on the 13th of September 2017. more than 3 years later, and it was published not long after that. So, nil desperandum, don't despair, keep going, and you'll get there. And there are some references, and I'll stop talking.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Very, very informative and helpful. Yeah, yes, there were fairly busy chat box there. Yeah, so it's people's chance really now to any comments or questions for Patrick while we're here. Karen made a comment that her professor says to have a citable statement in the conclusion. What a clever idea.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Alison. I agree, Karen. That's a great point. Something almost like a takeaway message, I guess. Is that how you mean that, Karen? That it's something that that you think this is something else that people can run with?
Yes, sorry. I'm just trying to get myself organized. Well, I think it's to increase obviously citations, and also because I attended another workshop about a month ago. They were talking about if you haven't got everything in the abstract, you lose a lot of people. It needs to contain everything. So if you can not only give them all the information plus a citable statement, then you've sort of covered everything for the people who are also going to read
That's
it.
a good point. Thanks, Karen. It's really hard to do, isn't it? Everything that's important down
Everything
to,
about it is hard.
yeah, to 200 or however many words it is. Oh, goodness me. Yes. No, but thank you. I agree. And that's a brilliant idea about the citable citation, yeah, statement. Yeah, absolutely. Excellent.
Okay, people are saying thank you very much. I appreciate all your workshops. People are running off to do other things. But what in our last few minutes, it is people's chance to, make another comment or open a discussion out if you like.
I
Thanks,
ask a question, please?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so during your PhD, you have to be published, right? And I was told you have to be published in a Q1 or Q2 journal. And we know how challenging that can be. Is that imperative to be in a Q1 or Q2 journal? What happens if you get a Q3 or 4?
Look, it's a great question, Karen. And as I said at the outset, I don't want to contradict anything that you've been told and so on. However, some of the PhD people I've worked with even recently have not published at all. Their PhD has been by thesis, and so they're publishing afterwards, and so that's perfectly okay.
Mine is by theses, but I was still told I had to be published before I could get the final yes for my thesis.
It seems to be a current thing at our university for PhD students.
Okay, interesting. And look, things are changing and so on. I guess, Karen, what I would say there is that to me, it goes back to fitness for purpose. If the best, if the most fit, that's not the right term, but if the most relevant journal is a Q3 or a Q4, I think that again, it's not about contradicting advice you've got or university regulation or whatever. But if I'm examining a thesis, I would want to see if there is a mandatory publication, that it's in a journal where it fits, because I think, oh, that's great, good work. It's going to be read by people who will actually resonate with it and so on. And so I guess I can't say definitively, Karen, but I think it just reinforces the point, doesn't it, that the selection of target journals is just so crucial. And it's really finding the work there. Can I just make it?
Did I just say something, Patrick?
Sorry, Craig. Yes, of course. Yeah.
Karen, look, there's lots of stuff going around about there's increasing need to publish and all that sort of stuff, even just to get entry into a PhD at this uni. But it depends on the school and all that sort of thing. And I know that supervisors sometimes get it wrong. They misunderstand what's happening. If in doubt, ask the grad school.
Thank you. And is it imperative to get it published in an international journal, or Australian Journal. Mine is on counsellors, the reason that they learn and use hypnotherapy within their practice. So
I'll
I've
check
been
with the
focusing
grad
my
school.
research in Australia. So should I obviously look worldwide, English, obviously English speaking journal worldwide rather than in Australia?
I'd ask the grad school.
Yeah.
Sage advice, Craig. Thanks, Karen. It's you know, it's part of the complexity, isn't it, that you're working in. My own view, grad school obviously really important. My own view is that an Australian journal, if they're the people most likely to be reading your work initially, that's entirely appropriate. It's a bit like, you know, nominating examiners, and again, SCU might have particular kinds of things, but you know, sometimes there's a blanket, oh, you need an international examiner or examiners, but actually sometimes the people best qualified to read your work are, you know, working up the road at another university in Australia because of the nature of the discipline you're working in and so on. So yeah, interesting times we're all working in.
Thank you.
Thanks.
There's a comment, a query from Samara in the text. She doesn't have a microphone. So building on Karen's question, I'm doing a PhD incorporating publication, which means I need to have her data chapters accepted, a figure accepted by a journal. Wondering in the journal selection if there's a way to identify the length of the review of feedback time. I wonder, because of the current papers, took 8 months to find the first round of reviewers.
It's such a good question, Alison, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And there's no easy answer because some reviewers are very quick and some reviewers aren't.
And one, Samara, you might have thought about this already. It is appropriate to contact the journal editors and to say, look, you know, as part of a general sortie or recce, to see if they can advise you. Sometimes they do have on the journal website indicatively. Some of the manuscripts I've been looking after have taken longer than I would like. And the only reason that I've persisted with that is that I can see, you know, that there's possibility to probability they'll be accepted. But I have written to the authors to say this is taking longer than any of us would like. And of course, you're most welcome if you wish to or need to withdraw your paper to send it to somewhere else. So as Alison says, sometimes people take longer. Sometimes people get very offended because the original reviewers are not willing or able to remain in the process. Often they are. People mostly are very generous, even in these interesting times, very good-hearted and generously spirited and stay the course. But some people, they're having babies or they're unwell or, you know, all of that kind of thing. And occasional authors say, well, why isn't the original reviewer around to look at my work and so on? It's, again, it's not intentional. It's a consequence of life, really.
I guess it's also worth reminding that reviewers are volunteers.
Yeah, yes, that's right.
They're not paid to review. So there was another comment there. Unless it's Q1, the uni doesn't recognize it if you're an academic. So, you know, there's another question for your whatever, head of school if you're in an academic, or HDR if you're a student. It's, you know, I think we've opened a can of worms here because the university is changing all the time about what they expect from academics and HDR students. But I guess there's policies on these things. I'm not sure.
There are policies, and also there are government policies, and I think you know, the REF in the UK, the research. It's not a research assessment exercise in Australia has had equivalent, which had Australian had a couple of different names and so on, which are, and I'm sure many people from SCU have participated in that, you know, where they get samples of academics' work and there are peer reviews and so on. It takes an enormous amount of effort. It's very expensive, and whether it actually increases the quality of research publications in Australia is very much a moot point. And my understanding is that scheme has ceased, but I might have that wrong because I haven't been involved for some time now. And of course, what does that mean if you're in a quartile 4 journal? Does that mean you give up the ghost and say, oh, we'll never get to Q1, we may as well stop now? There are, as we know, there are huge questions. These are big businesses, Elsevier and so on, versus the democratization of languages. Some of the language art journals I've most enjoyed being published in don't exist anymore, and they started out as open access, and it was very much about sharing the work, and as long as someone had access to the internet they could download. And so the Queensland Journal of Educational Research was brilliant, not just because it published me, more importantly it published really good articles across a long period of time. And fortunately, because of one person's goodwill, there's an archive somewhere that people can go along and download previous issues. But otherwise, that's lost. And that's decades of really good work. It's just one example. So it is part of a broader conversation that we're all part of.
Mm, mm. As you say, receiving minor revisions is a time to celebrate, really.
That's right. Yes.
And the feedback usually lifts the paper. So,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yes, exactly.
One of my mistakes, including participants, verbatim, is not including my ethics approval number.
Oh, okay.
So a simple oversight, but a good reminder. So minor
Yeah.
revisions are okay.
Shows people have read the work and so on. I think
Yeah,
Melissa,
yeah.
Sorry.
Thanks, Karen. So people are heading off. Yeah, Melissa. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks, Patrick. Great presentation. Loved it. Wrote tons of notes, so thank you.
Thanks.
Quick question. So I am at the precipice of just kicking off my first master's project and everything, and we're looking to publish. Let's say, for example, we've run the project, we've got our results, and, we've been running a bit of an audit trail of steps that have been taken, blah, blah, blah. Is the next step in the process to have a look at journals that are appropriate and see what their word count and requirements are for formatting, then write it to meet those needs and hope for the best, but then have the plan B and C? Is that what you're doing?
That's right. Yes. I think when I started, I just wrote the first paper. Well, great question. I think I just wrote the first paper and then went looking for journals. And these days they're so different and so on. So absolutely, obviously have an idea for what's going in that first paper, but absolutely nailing down your in the ideal world, I would love the first paper to be published in this first target journal. And then and it can be very tedious. Sometimes people, if you use EndNote or something similar, it helps with the referencing, but not always, because journals, for whatever reasons, have their own take on APA or whatever the referencing system might be, and so on. And so for a Luddite like me who doesn't use EndNote, it's very tedious, changing over and so on. But absolutely doing that. And in the process of doing that, of course, you're immersing yourself in those journals, aren't you, and seeing what they're writing about, and you're finding hooks that you can connect with and so on. And it's also a great opportunity, Melissa, I wish you well with that. It sounds really exciting. And part of that, I think, is working out, almost like slicing and dicing the data to say, well, look, from this data set, we can get 3 or 4 different publications or whatever it might be. So yeah, that sounds great.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, Melissa, too, some journals will provide like a Word template to write into.
I was hoping that would be the case. Yeah.
Not all of them do, but the big ones do. Yeah.
Yeah. And then to find an appropriate journal, is it just as simple as just Googling and having a look through databases and the SCE library, just sort of digging around? Is there a technique that you recommend when trying to find one?
That's really good, and I think Jen put something in the chat that's also very useful from her literature review and so on. That's a really good technique as well. Melissa, I'm not sure of your context and so on, but I would also look at Schemago, which is the repository for the quartiles and so on, because that's got useful information about not just what quartile it is now, but where it has been recently and all of that kind of thing. But it's also got other useful information, probably more about indicators and so on. But and of course, if something is not in Schemago, it can still exist. You know, it doesn't mean you should give up on that, but it's just one indicator. So I think there are quite a few different sources of potential journals, and it's just a matter of working through and enjoying the process and learning, you know, I hadn't thought about that. I think this particular part of the work could link with or contribute to a debate in that journal or whatever it might be. Yeah. Absolutely. Also, just on journals, sometimes, and I've done a few of these over the years, is special issues. And so special issues are very interesting, I think, because I don't know empirically, but I have the impression that if you've got a good paper, you've got an increased chance of being published in that journal if it aligns with that special issue. And the reason for that is, as a former special issue editor myself, I'm often on the hunt. You know, I'm looking for something new, something novel, whether that's a particular geographical area or whether it's a theoretical you know, contribution or something innovative about the methodology. And so, and you know, you can sign up for these alerts, but also, again, just hunting through journals, often they've got on their front page somewhere, forthcoming special issues. And it may be interesting just having a quick look at those to see if you can contribute in some particular way.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a comment there from Samara about processing fees for journals.
Again, that's, you know, that should be on the journal website, Samara.
But she's been asked to pay a processing fee.
With fees, certainly the journals I'm familiar with, they recognise that particularly individual students often don't have the means to do that. And so I can't comment on that specific one, but I've certainly seen even recently a text to the effect that we do have an opportunity for open access, whether that's gold or green, and I've forgotten the differentiators there, but and typically this is from research teams that have the funds to do so, you know. So if Samara, and I'm sure you've already thought of this, if this is the best by far target journal that you can think of, and they're insisting on this payment, then it's that you've got nothing to lose by contacting the editor and saying, look, this is my context. I can't actually afford this. My university doesn't, I'm not eligible for funds and so on. Is there a dispensation? Is it possible to get an exception to this? And see what they say. There is no doubt we live in the very interesting times where there are journals who, you know, have high article processing fees, and sometimes you think, is this a journal? Will I ever see my work again? Will it be published? So obviously you have to be really careful.
Okay, someone asking about slides, so we'll send those out to
Sure.
everyone in a day or three.
Yes, yeah.
We might stop recording there, and thanks so much. We've gone over time. It's obviously stimulated some great discussion there. So thank you, everyone.
Sorry about that, but it's a good conversation.